Hey folks, welcome back to NC State Dendrology. So we are moving west in our journey across North America, looking at forest types. And so for this lecture and the next lecture, I'm breaking them up to keep them a little bit on the shorter side. We're going to focus on forest types of the Rocky Mountains. And like I said before, I think one of the challenges is we're going to have to look at these in a really broad brush way. So not a lot of detail. And I think it's also a little bit difficult if you're unfamiliar with these forests to sort of keep them sorted. So I'm going to use some videos that we'll pull into Play Pause It to give you a little bit more of a sense of what it's like walking through those forests, since it's not something that we can visit on a field trip since I don't have Magic School Bus. So this is a Forest Service map looking at forest types across North America. This is the Forest Inventory and Analysis FIA data put out by the US Forest Service. And so we've spent a lot of time talking about forests in the East and then also the Northeast and Great Lakes states and up into Canada. Today we're going to focus on the next two lectures. We're going to focus on this area of the Rocky Mountains. So we have the Great Plains here in the middle, so not a lot of forest types here. And we're going to look at these forest types, and you can see that although some of the forest types are shared north to south, there are some important latitudinal differences. And so we'll talk about those in turn. A lot of the forest types that we're going to talk about today center on the southern half of the Rocky Mountains. So before we get to the Rockies, let's talk a little bit about the central United States. And I have this map linked here so you can look at it on your own time and kind of look through the forest type groups. I cut out the key here just so we could have a maximum picture. But if we think about the prairie complex in the central United States, thinking about, areas, it's not like there are no trees at all. They certainly follow the river lines, but for the most part, this is a grassland type area. And so it's less than 10% forested overall. So we would call that treeless. So why is that? Why do you think we don't have forests in the prairie complex? Right, so if you guessed the lack of rainfall, right, we have less than 15 inches of rain in these areas. And so the rainfall is not enough to support tree growth. We see in the Midwest less than a rain shadow effect, right, which makes these areas very dry. You actually see this pattern repeated all over the world in interior continental areas that a lot of the rain pulls into and drops over the coastal areas, especially associated with mountains. And then on the inside of the interior of those continents, it tends to be very dry. We certainly see that in Australia and also the Asian continent. So let's talk a little bit more about the rain shadow effect and what that is, right? So when we're talking about rain shadows, right, on this diagram, it's here on the far right. This is an area of low rainfall, and it's on the leeward side, so on the dry side of a mountain range, so away from the prevailing weather system. So in this little diagram schematic here, you have, right, the weather system here on the left side of the diagram. You have the water body here, which is bringing in weather systems from the Pacific Ocean in this case. And you have prevailing winds bringing moist air in from the oceans. And then as that air rises to go over the mountains, in this case, we're talking about the Rocky Mountains, that rising air cools and it's not able to hold as much water. And so you have the water condensing and falling as rain. So you often have areas of very high rainfall, in this case, on the west side of the Rocky Mountains. And then after that air drops the water over the mountains, that air continues to move, in this case, to the east. And you see a rain shadow, an area that's much drier on the backside of those mountains. So prairie ecosystems tend to have between 15 and 20 inches of annual rainfall. So that's really common. In that prairie, we're talking about grassland areas. And then deserts, which are even drier than prairies. And there's not even enough annual rainfall to support steady, long season perennial grasses. Those areas are less than 10 inches of rain per year. For about a year and a half, my family lived in Phoenix, Arizona, which had an annual rainfall of about 7 inches a year, which made for a really fascinating Sonoran desert ecosystem if you got outside of the city to see it. And so you can see that right, we have this extensive area of prairie in the central United States. And then if you can imagine these warm, wet air masses coming in from the Pacific, we drop a lot of rainfall here in the Sierras, which we'll talk about next week. And then we have dry areas, right? So this area here is considered the Great Basin. And then we have more rainfall dropping over the Rockies, and then we have extensive dry areas in the central continent. So just some quick facts about the Rockies, right? So the Rocky Mountain Complex stretches from Alberta all the way into Mexico. So it's this mountain range here, right? Don't confuse it with the Sierras. We'll get there, and the Cascades. And so the states that are included are Montana, Idaho, North Dakota, South Dakota to some degree, although they're more grassland areas, Kansas, Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, parts of Texas, Arizona, and Wyoming are all included in this Rocky Mountain Complex. You can see the mountainous areas though end, right? So this is Colorado, Wyoming, right? So they kind of extend in a northwest to southeast direction. And so generally speaking, if you've ever been to see these mountains, they are much more jagged. They're not rounded and eroded like our southern Appalachians, which are much older and more eroded. So because these mountains are taller and younger, they also tend to be drier and more rugged than the southern Appalachians and the Appalachian Mountain in general. We say they're younger. They were formed between 80 and 55 million years ago. And then in Mexico, where this range extends into Mexico, they become the Sierra Madre, but it's really part of the same mountain system. Just a quick touch on the Sierra Madre Mountains, right? So the Rockies split and become two separate mountain ranges to the south as it extends into Mexico. So the word Sierra means a rocky, jagged mountain range. That's the translation of that word. And then Madre means mother. And then in Mexico, you'll see there's Sierra Madre Oriental, Oriental meaning Eastern, translation of that, and Sierra Madre Occidental. And we've just learned species with occidentalis is a specific epithet. So we know that means Western, with a kind of a dry, plain rain shadow area in the center. So in the Rocky Mountains, we can talk about environmental gradients. So if you look out over this mountain range photo, I think this is taken at Mount Elbert, Colorado, the Rockies are only about a third covered with forest, about 30%. The forest is very patchy, right? So you have large areas that are rocky and aren't conducive for growing trees. But some quick stats about the Rockies. The highest peak is Mount Elbert, Colorado, 14,433 feet. This is actually an accessible hike. It's outside of Leadville, Colorado. Had a chance to climb that with my family. And I guess an important thing here is the base, like where you're starting from, this valley down here, is also fairly high, right? So if you fly into Denver, it's called the Mile High Airport. And so even though it's at the very base of the Rocky Mountains, it's already above 6,000 feet. So that might shift your thinking a little bit, because in the East Coast, right, 6,000 feet is our highest peaks in the East Coast. So in the Rockies, you're starting out really high already. So you're already starting out high and much drier plateau. And generally, compared to the East, it has much drier, much lower annual average precipitation. Denver having about 12 inches per year, right? So really on the edge of what's possible for trees. And then Salt Lake City is 14 inches annually, just to give you a general basis or set your thinking accordingly. So when we think about key environmental factors that affect forests in the Rocky Mountains, elevation is probably a huge factor here, probably the biggest and most important factor in the Rocky Mountains, because we have such a wide range of elevations. And that, of course, as we know, affects both moisture as well as temperature and growing season. Rainfall matters. It depends on if you're in the southern versus northern part of the Rockies, and also eastern versus western, and where you are in relation to that rain shadow. The aspect, right, that also plays into moisture levels, whether you're on the rain shadow, the eastern side of the Rockies, or the western side, which is wetter. That definitely makes a difference. Topography, what the landscape and landform looks like, and whether that can support trees. The fire history is a really important factor here. Fire is a major disturbance in the Rockies, and lots of fire history and fire change, even in the last couple of decades. At the lower elevations, water and moisture is kind of the limiting factor for tree growth. And then at the higher elevations, right, we have other factors. So snowfall, you definitely reach climatic tree line in the Rockies as well. So we're going to look at, again, we're breaking this down into very general forest types. And so my thinking here is that if you were able to travel out here, you'll have some general sense of where you are based on the elevation. You can see this is definitely dictated by elevation, and rainfall is also correlated with this. So for each of these forest types, we'll talk about the structure of the forest, the general physiognomy, the species composition, so some of the important species, which we will learn in lab, and the environmental drivers, the ecology, and the threats to these systems. And so in this short lecture, we're going to talk briefly about the transition, right? We're talking about non-forest to forest, so mostly kind of shrublands. Then we'll talk about woodlands and submontane. So we'll talk about those three types in the Rocky Mountain Forest region. So this is a really diverse area. And if you have a chance to learn about these systems in more depth, I highly recommend it. So this is your general start to the transition zone, right? So you can see the Rockies kind of arise here out of nowhere from this big flat plain. And we have primarily sagebush, but there's also creosote bush and maybe mesquite there. And so we tend to find these transition zones on the east side of the Rockies where moisture is still a major limiting factor. So generally this occurs between areas that are too dry to support trees, but just wet enough for shrubs and maybe some small trees you can see mixed in here in this photo. And so in the Rocky Mountains, these areas occur between 4,000 and 5,500 feet elevation. They are the plants that can live there are because of limited rainfall. So less than 15 inches of rainfall. So we know that doesn't support forest. And the physiognomy, the structure of these is that it's a shrubby hardwood. And so in the drier areas, you'll see that there's a lot more spacing between shrubs because individual shrubs take up the water that's in their immediate vicinity. But when you get with a little more rainfall, you can see it becomes more dense. These areas are susceptible. One of the threats that's kind of unique to the system is overgrazing. There's a lot of ranches out in this area of the Rockies. And sometimes you'll hear people call this sagebrush. So we'll talk about the different principal species that are here. So this sagebush here is Artemisia tridentata. This is a really ubiquitous species in the Southwest. When I lived out there, you'd see vast areas that were covered with this sagebush. Interestingly, there is a little oak out here. It's a really cute little shrubby oak called gambel oak. So Quercus gambellii. This is not one that we'll learn in lab, but pretty neat little species. I was randomly looking at shrubs as I was walking around doing some hiking out in that area. And suddenly I noticed that they had these little miniature oak leaves and acorns. So that told me it was an oak, which was really interesting to learn with this low shrubby kind of form. It really doesn't get to be a tree. And then mountain mahogany, Sericocorpus, SP, there's several different species. And so this transition zone is very common on the eastern half of the Rockies in Colorado, New Mexico, these high plains and high desert areas in New Mexico, and certainly throughout Arizona. So looking at that range map there. So this is, definitely we're talking about the southern Rocky Mountains in this case. And this photo was taken at Colorado National Monument on a trip I made with my family. So this area, you can look at it and think, this is really dry. This is a water limited environment when you look at this picture. And you can see that these shrubs are scattered and spaced, and that's a result of limited water. So it's kind of a cool area with these high plateaus. And then this is an area that's a little bit more moist, right? And so you're starting to get into, some of these are probably junipers and pinyon pines, which is in our next community. But you can see that the shrubs are definitely more dense, more of the ground is covered as you get into areas with more moisture. So that's really important. And actually that's a transition, right? So let's just go back here for a minute. So the shrublands are lower down, but you can see that these are both a mixture of shrubs and also kind of stunted and small trees. And so this is what the general look of the woodland zone in the Rocky Mountains, which you can see the extent of it here, generally in the southern Rockies, but it does extend into California and also a little bit into the Great Basin. So in the Rockies, this is found between 5,500 and 6,000 feet elevation. And the physiognomy, right, the structure of this forest type, it's a woodland zone, right? So if you recall back to our woodland, this is 15 to 18 inches of annual rainfall. Means that you can have some trees, but there's space. There's not a closed canopy forest. Commonly, we call this the pinyon pine juniper woodland. And this is a really important and very extensive woodland type, plant community type throughout the Southwest. And so this has deep cultural roots in the indigenous people and tribes that live in these areas. I have this video that I'm going to put into Playposit about how pinyon pine is a very important food source for the Navajo. And I have the link here if you want to watch that on your own. This photo here is taken in Zion National Park, which is in southern Utah. And this is a pinyon pine my kids are standing underneath up at Angel's Landing. Really cool hike up in that area. So again, the structure, right, here's more pictures of the structure. So you've got larger shrubs. Also the north rim of the south rim of the Grand Canyon is this woodland zone, if you've ever visited that area. The principal species are pinyon pine, which is Pinus edulis. We will learn this in lab. It's really great, really interesting species because the seeds are animal dispersed, right? The seeds are actually very, very large. And then we also have Rocky Mountain juniper, Juniperus scapulorum. So scapulorum, I didn't practice that one before I started lecturing. But you can see it has a pretty recognizable, right? You could look at it and think, that looks like a juniper. That looks like the eastern red cedar I know from the east. And you'd be right, right? So your training is taking you now outside of the Southeast to recognize patterns. Of course, seeing these cones makes you realize that this is some type of pine. And these pines are really interesting. They have very short, fat needles and also short, very round cones. And these big cone scales are hiding the very large pine nuts, as they're called, or pinyon nuts that are inside of those cones that are extremely tasty. In Italy, these are pignolia nuts. So there's a species of pinyon pine that grows in Europe as well. It's a really interesting community there that's very extensive. We'll look back at our Forest Service map in just a minute. So I'm showing you this picture now, and if you look, you should immediately notice that we are in a different community type. So if you can imagine starting at the base of a mountain in this transition zone with sagebush everywhere, and then as you climb, right, you get into the pinyon pine juniper woodland, climb a little further, and suddenly you've got canopy trees. And so this is ponderosa pine forest. This is also an extensive forest type around the Southwest, and one that's been in the news quite a lot because of forest fires. You can still see some shrubs in the understory, but not a whole lot of herbaceous species here. And these ponderosa pines might remind you a little bit of loblolly. They're actually fairly similar. This is another species that's very important and extensive in the United States. So we will learn these in lab. So this submontane zone, right, ponderosa pine forest, is found between 6,000 and 7,000 feet in elevation, which seems like kind of a narrow range. So your annual rainfall is now enough to support a open to closed canopy forest. And so this forest type has really shifted. It used to be more of an open savanna. If you think about what a longleaf pine forest looks like, if I go back here, you can see the canopies are not really touching. It's more of an open forest type. And that's kind of the way ponderosa pine forests used to be when there was fire was a regular part of this landscape. The forests today are much denser, and there's a lot of problems associated with that. This is all a result of fire suppression. This is a major threat to these ecosystems. And we'll watch a video about these ponderosa pine ecosystems and how they're trying to do some fire, reintroduce fire to do some restoration of the traditional structure for ponderosa pine forests. These are really wonderful forests to walk through. The ponderosa pine, you can see this one is, again, scattered trees, pretty open, so probably fire has been reintroduced here. The trees smell like vanilla. The bark smells like vanilla, so Pinus ponderosa, this beautiful orange-barked, large-plated pine. And you can see ponderosa pine is found throughout the West, right? So we're kind of concentrating on the Rockies, but you'll also see it farther north and also in California. So Pinus ponderosa should be a pretty familiar looking species to you. So Pinus ponderosa has this, really nice vanilla scented, very, very thick bark. So the bark is a major adaptation for fire. It will slough off during fire. So the ponderosa pine by nature is able to survive and withstand fire once it reaches maturity. And the crowns grow pretty open. You may have noticed that in some of the other pictures. So they dissipate heat. So they tend to release heat into the atmosphere. This is considered to be one of the most fire resilient pines because of that thick bark. And that only increases with age. So if you think about the result of that, if you have regular fire and you have one species that's really resistant to it, you're going to end up with the kind of stand that we had in the past. So if you look at the top part of this diagram, right, you have ponderosa pines growing here. You may have some seedlings, right? So like other pines, ponderosa pine is shade intolerant, but with this wide space canopy, enough light reaches the forest floor to have seedlings. But with regular fire, many of those seedlings are eliminated. And so what you have as a result is a stand structure that is more of a woodland with an open canopy than a closed canopy forest. So this fire resistance results in this open submontane ponderosa pine forest. To identify ponderosa pine, we'll talk about this in lab, but there are 3 needles per fascicle with large cones. So if this sounds a lot like loblolly pine, you would be right. And the current stand, where we are now with ponderosa pine forests, right, we have with fire suppression, when ponderosa pine reaches the stage with lots of understory, right, there's no fire to eliminate some of those seedlings. And so they end up growing up and you end up with a very, very dense stand. If you compare the fire in this third diagram here in the past to the one that is in the current scenario, when you have this big buildup of fuel, that results in much hotter, more catastrophic fires. And this is something that we're seeing all over the West, in the Rocky Mountains, in these ponderosa pine stands. You've got such a buildup of fuel from a past of fire succession that you end up with these extremely hot, very difficult to control, if not impossible to control, crown fires that completely torch this ecosystem. And so these stands are changing really rapidly. Some of the restoration work that's being done that we'll talk about in this video is taking these really dense pine stands here and then doing some thinning, right, to pull out some of the understory trees to make it a little bit more open, and then reintroducing fire in these low prescribed levels to try and restore that kind of open canopy woodland that reflects the ponderosa pine forest in the past. You can't just reintroduce fire in a stand that looks like this because there's too much fuel and you risk too much wildfire. So in order to really restore these effectively, you've got to eliminate some of the mid-story trees and even some of the canopy crown to get those out of there to reduce the fuel loads before you're ready to introduce fire. And if you look at the fire dendrochronology, is always really interesting. You can see this is a section of very old ponderosa pine, and you can see the regular fire intervals that are reflected in the tree rings. So this is part of the Rocky Mountain tree ring research. And I just think this is so interesting to see, the interval of fire that was fairly frequent, right? And then starting after colonial settlement, right, when Forest Service got established, right, in the early 1900s, and then fires were suppressed that was seen to damage the resource. And as a result, we have this long interval with no fire. This is not great resolution, but these are original photos taken from 1909 to 1968. And you can see this change in the structure of these ponderosa pine forests. So, a very open structure here, taken in 1909. And then you can see in the absence of fire, you've got this, understory growing up. And then this large pine here was cut in 1952. You can still see the stump here in 1968. But this forest at the end is very, very different from what we have here. And then 1989, you have even more dense, 1997, even more dense. So this is really a thicket comparing 1997 with 1909. And then in the adjacent forest where there was, more of some ecosystem management, restoration, and reintroduction of fire, the adjacent stand is kind of what the target is. So if you're working in forest restoration, right, you might be looking at what is this forest stand? You might use historical forest photographs to better understand how these forest types have changed and what your target is if you're doing restoration work. It was really startling. My family and I visited the North Rim of the Grand Canyon, and my husband and I had been there 20 years back, but to visit 20 years later, there are large areas of ponderosa pine. You look at this photograph carefully, what do you see? So you probably see that this was a crown fire, right? These trees are completely torched. So this is a case where you had a very high density of trees, of very high fuel loads. And so when fire did get in here, it was completely out of control. And so there are large sections of the Rockies that now have had these catastrophic wildfires. In addition to fire suppression, we also have climate change that's causing changes in the precipitation patterns. So we have extensive drought, which makes these systems much more susceptible to to catastrophic wildfires. Then that's compounded by a history of fire suppression and fuel buildup. Because you have these very dense forest stands, they are also more susceptible to beetle outbreaks. And so there's people who are studying kind of these cycles of fire and beetle damage and drought, and looking at how these factors, these ecosystem factors, interact. So there's definitely interactions going on driven by things like climate change, which is causing changes in precipitation patterns. So that takes us through the kind of the mid-level forests in mainly focusing on the Southern Rockies, and we'll look at higher elevations and higher latitudes in the next set of lectures. But some basic information I want you to know about the Rockies is the region, right? The extent of that region, precipitation and elevation being the major environmental factors that predict what forest type you have. If you're looking at a map, you have precipitation and elevation, you could probably, with some reasonable degree of accuracy, predict what forest type you'll have there. These lower elevations in the Rockies that we talked about today are water stressed, and so they don't tend to have closed canopy forests. And we can account for that limits in precipitation because of the rain shadow effect, right? So I want you to really understand the rain shadow and how that works and why these areas are so dry. That's what explains that. We definitely see a transition from a steppe, right? So scattered trees and shrubs. That's called the steppe in Asia, but kind of a high desert shrubland area to woodland zone with scattered trees. So we've seen a change in the physiognomy as we climb and get more precipitation. The transition zone, I want you to know that is dominated by sagebush and gamble oak. Woodland zone dominated by pinyon pine and juniper. And Pinus edulis is a species that we learn in lab. Ponderosa pine, Pinus ponderosa, is another species we learn in lab. So this is a very important species, and I would not be doing my job teaching dendrology if you didn't know about these very important species in the West. The biggest threat, certainly in the submontane zone, which is the ponderosa pine forest, is this history of fire suppression that has compounded climate change effects and has led to catastrophic wildfires. And the last thing I would just want to say, just as a bridge to the next lecture, the northern areas of the Rocky Mountains generally lack these lower elevation forest types. The northern areas are not as water and drought stressed. And so you're not going to see pinyon pine, juniper, woodland in places like Montana. And just to wrap, we'll come back and talk about those forest ecosystems in the Northern Rockies next.